guys, so today I wanted to cover the material for analysis in chapters 7 and 8 of the Dressmaker, and again we'll be focusing our analysis on comparison with the Crucible. So in chapter 7 we see that Pearl calls Myrtle by her actual name Myrtle, and Teddy corrects her and says that she goes by Tilly now. So Pearl sees Myrtle as the kind of Tilly of the past. She still thinks of her as the child Myrtle, whereas Teddy sees her as the current Tilly, and that's one of the important ways that we can draw the distinction between the two. When she's referred to as Myrtle, it's referring to her of the past, and when she's referred to as Tilly, it's talking about her of the present. So we also see what happens when people from outside of an insular society enter, and we see that through the shearer, and we also see that through some of the other men at the bar at the pub who basically make trouble. So they create conflict with Teddy, they try to shame or they make suggestive comments about Pearl and her past with Bill Beaumont. They talk about Tilly and they suggest that they go to Beulah Harradine for the gossip. And the reason why they're able to do this is because they're not bound by the same social contracts of the people as the people who live in Dungatar. So that's, I suppose, part of the reason why there's this pervasive sense of wariness towards outsiders, and that includes Tilly. Which really brings us to our next point about insular societies. So in The Dressmaker, Tilly, who is an outsider, comes into an insular society and creates change. And we'll talk about this idea of creating change a little later, because arguably she doesn't really create any change at all. But basically, in this text, we see that a lot of times the outsides match the insides, and she transforms the town's appearance, and in doing so symbolically transforms the kind of ethos and the social contract of the town. And there's this deeply ingrained dysfunction of their society, and she literally demolishes all of it by burning it. And we'll get back to this in a little bit, because there are different interpretations of this. Whereas in the Crucible, the people bring outsiders in to deal with an internal problem. And really, change here stems from the oppression of women, and there's this kind of fear of accusation of witchcraft and the grip of theocracy which drives them to do this. So the people destroy each other because of their personal grudges, their paranoia, and their intimate knowledge of each other, whereas in The Dressmaker, an outsider comes in and changes the status quo. Now, in Chapter 7, we also see that football is kind of a form of social capital. So what do I mean by that? I mean that football is a way through which people gain social acceptance, and we see that that's one of the ways that Teddy gains conditional acceptance in his society or his community. Now, we also see a little bit of foreshadowing for William Beaumont and Gertrude, and how their marriage will be largely loveless and cold, because we see William looking fearful with his arms crossed against Gertrude when she's trying to flirt with him. And it's a little bit funny, a little bit ironic. There's just a little joke there that Rosalie Ham has thrown in. Septimus Crescent says we won't be flooded when the end comes. He's a flat earther, and little does he know, their town will literally burn to the ground. Fire, water, there's a joke in there somewhere, but we'll get into that a little bit later. She likes to make little jokes like that. Rosalie Ham really is an author after my own heart. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. So, Chapter 7 is a really short chapter. A lot of it's just kind of descriptions of football. It's kind of boring, so I decided to throw in Chapter 8 as well. So in Chapter 8, we start off at the train station, and we see Hamish O'Brien saying, "Damn progress," and he's talking to Ruth, because she's there to collect the mail. So we see that he selfishly clings onto the illusion of stillness and idyllicism. He doesn't want the town to change. So he enjoys the romanticism of a small country town, and he kind of puts that above the convenience of others. There's a kind of selfishness to that. And we see that throughout in a lot of the ways that people's attitudes are reflected in their actions. So we'll see a lot more of that as the text progresses. Now, once again, Rosalie Ham is an author after my own heart. A lot of references, a lot of literary references that I like, and also she doesn't use Oxford commas, which I really appreciate. Anyway, so she mentions the town and the city, and it comes in. It's one of the items that comes in Tilly's mail. So the town and the city is about the Martin family, and the protagonist goes from a country town to a big city. Once again, there's a case of manslaughter in the town and the city, and we see that too in the Dressmaker. So there's almost this sense of like a little hint, a little clue as to what's going to happen, or what we're going to find out anyway, because one of the cases of manslaughter, in fact the only case of manslaughter arguably, has already happened. We just don't know about it yet. Okay, now there's also mention of Hemingway. We've talked about Hemingway before with the theory of omission and the iceberg writing theory. Now, there's a two-in-one like sucker punch here for Ruth. So Ruth isn't able to appreciate Hemingway's writing because A, she's too shallow and she doesn't want to read it if there's no romance involved, and two, because she's unable to see past the surface, because we know that Hemingway is all about hiding the true essence of his writing beyond the surface meaning of the words. We also see Ruth abusing her power in going through other people's mail, and we see that later as well when she kind of tries to keep people's insurance money for herself. So Ruth and Nancy, we see them sampling Tilly's cannabis orally, and it knocks them out. And then we also see them drinking Tilly's henna. Now, one thing to note here is that we see a lot of items for Tilly from America and Europe, and the reason why we see that specifically is because in the 1950s, they were the kind of frontier of progress, because it was during the Cold War era and they made what we call progress for the sake of progress. So they were always trying to one-up each other, America and the USSR, and by extension Europe. Not to say that all of Europe was on Russia's side, that couldn't be further from the truth, but basically those two regions of the world were the frontiers of progress. Now, Teddy, again, we see here being a simp. So Tilly doesn't want to trust him, she doesn't want to accept help from him or let him into her life. And it's because she's been hurt before by Ormond and literally everyone else in the town. And she believes that she's cursed. So we also see that Molly says that Tilly mixes things up, potions, and says that they're herbs. Now, the word potions is separated from the rest of the sentence because it's purposely evoking a sense of mysticism and hearkening to witchcraft. So we also see that she receives her herbs in a chest, which once again harkens to witchcraft and mysticism. And Molly says any mother of yours could only live in a coven, and she means that as an insult, but it's kind of ironic because Molly is her mother. They live in a home together alone, two women. They're isolated and they're ostracized, and one practices herb law. Oh, that should be practices with... Oh no, that's the correct practices. Yeah, good. Yeah, so we see two very different takes on witchcraft in these two texts. So in the Dressmaker, witchcraft is something empowering and it's portrayed in a positive light. So Tilly and Molly kind of embody that tripartite goddess as we talked about, but later what we didn't talk about is the fact that Tilly ends up embodying all three on her own, because after Molly dies she becomes this harbinger of doom, which is the hag's role in the triple goddess. So she becomes this pagan symbol of feminine power. We also see that she uses herb law to wrest power from the men of Dungatar so that their female counterparts can exact justice on them, knowingly or unknowingly. So in the case of Mr. Pettyman, she uses marigolds, and Marigold ends up killing him. And in the case of Mr. Almanac, she gives Mrs. Almanac weed, and as a result, she isn't there. She gets knocked out by the weed. Well, I suppose it's a possibility, and it's quite plausible, because based on Nancy's reaction to her unresponsiveness, it's a very new occurrence that she's unresponsive to Mr. Almanac rolling down the street in his wheelchair. But basically, there's an implication there that the reason why she was asleep was because she was knocked out by Tilly's weed. So basically, here in The Dressmaker, it's a good thing. It's empowering. Whereas in the Crucible, witchcraft is this myth that serves a political purpose. So it oppresses the women because it drives fear into them. It drives fear of the law and fear of men into them. And in the case of Salem specifically, the women turn on each other for fear of being exposed as witches themselves. Now in Chapter 8, we see Eiderdown or Eiderdown. I am not the authority on how to pronounce the names of different ducks, but we see Eiderdown in Ruth and Nancy's home, and Eiderdown is only taken from female ducks, and the way it works is because it's quite a rare material and it only comes from a specific kind of duck. They don't want to hurt the ducks, so they only take feathers from nests that the females build by plucking the feathers out of their own chests. But anyway, so it creates this sense of a female space specifically. Nothing in that space is meant to be for men. Nothing within that space is supposed to be something that men are privy to. Now we see the lines where they say, oh, nothing happened to me neither, and then this sudden break, and then it says they woke. And there's no kind of skip there. It's just a new line, and it just says they woke. So the quick succession of the two lines suggests that Ruth and Nancy passed out, and we see that Tilly lies to get a reaction out of them. So once again, it's just the subtext of it, but I find that a lot of students miss the subtext. Basically, they drank Tilly's henna, but Tilly leads them to think that it was fertilizer made out of bat poo. Okay, so we also see May McSweeney say nothing ever changes Myrtle. And the reason why this is so poignant in this chapter is because it's contrasted with the items arriving from Europe and the fact that the trains are moving on and progressing. So one question you might ask is if it's actually true if nothing ever really changes. And in the case of the Dressmaker, arguably things change, but arguably nothing is resolved at the conclusion of the novel. So I talked about before how she symbolically burns everything away, but that's actually more about Tilly's personal trauma, in my opinion, and I would argue that nothing is really resolved at the conclusion. So we get a sense of satisfaction in the ending. We feel like it's a satisfactory ending because she's punished everyone, and we see character development in Tilly. She goes from being timid and having to lock her knees together so that they don't shake when she confronts the people of her past, to fearlessly confronting them and basically wreaking havoc on their town. So that's where our kind of sense of satisfaction in the ending is derived from. But at the end of the day, the people themselves are so clueless that nothing has changed for them. They're just going to continue living on as they did before until he's going to leave. Yet there's this implication through the trains that progress is inevitable, but the people of Dungatar are just too set in their ways to acknowledge that. Now, in the Crucible, change actually happens, and we see that through Reverend Hale, who goes from this witch hunter to someone who, to a man of reason who has contemplated his actions and rethought what he kind of approached the situation with. He rethought the approach with which he kind of looked at the situation. We also see that after Salem, it was kind of the end of the witch trials, and Arthur Miller describes it as the end of theocracy in America. I don't agree with that. I think white people in America still really, really love Jesus and want him in the law, but that's, once again, we're not here to debate politics. in the Crucible, Arthur Miller says that that is the end of the witch trials, therefore we see change happening. Okay, so in chapter 8, we also see Irma Almanac tell Tilly that there's going to be rain, but only enough to settle the dust. In the novel, rain symbolizes the washing away of Tilly's fears and doubts. So, when she says that there's only enough to settle the dust, it's referring to the fact that Tilly is able to put her fears and doubts away long enough to settle there. We also see that there's a downpour after Molly's death later on in the novel, and that's an example of what we would call pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy, despite its name, isn't actually a logical fallacy. It's just the term for the literary device whereby authors use weather as a way of representing someone's feelings. We also see the fact that the rain after Molly's death washes away the garbage, the flaming garbage that the people of Dungatar kind of left at the base of the hill. And in that sense, the rain washes away the kind of filth and the badness and the darkness in her past, and acts as a catalyst for a recovery, and it acts as a catalyst for a vengeance as well when Molly dies. Okay, so they try to avoid talking about absent babies and brutal men. So we see the puzzle pieces coming together, and we find out that Molly has been hurt by some man in the past. We just don't know who it is yet. Okay, and Irma Almanac asks Tilly, "Why have you come back here? You know, a girl as smart and pretty as you." And she says, "Why not?" And once again, this comes back to the theory of omission. We're not told why she comes back. We're made to question that for ourselves. I would argue that the reason why she's come back is for healing and closure. Okay, the rest of chapter 8 is mainly just the plot, progressing with Tilly warming up to Teddy and Molly acting mad. There's not all that much to analyze there, but arguably you could say that Molly's madness and the way that she hurts herself is a representation of the way in which Tilly sabotages her own happiness, because it does stop once Tilly stops rejecting Teddy's advances, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. I don't believe that to be true. I don't think that it's symbolic of Tilly's own self-sabotage, but I suppose there is a case to be made. If that will support your analysis in an essay, you could write about it. Now, there are a couple of references that she makes. Once again, she's a very referential writer, whereas Arthur Miller is very direct. So one gets meaning across in references, and the other says it explicitly in words. So South Pacific is a fun one because it's a play, and it's about it's kind of about love that's forbidden by social circumstances. So like this was in the late 1940s that the late 1940s when the play first was performed in America. But it was about interracial relationships and how they were supposed to be navigated and how they were navigated in a time where they didn't find acceptance. And there's this sense of subversion in Tilly and Teddy's own union or their relationship, because they're kind of in different places in the minds of the people of Dungatar, where Tilly is kind of the very bottom of the totem pole. She's an outcast, whereas Teddy is kind of half in, half out. He's a McSweeney. They don't like McSweeneys, but at the same time, they kind of like him. Okay, we see a reference to Billie Holiday. So she turns off, she tries not to engage in the kind of happy banter, and she puts on Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday is a blues icon. She sang the song Strange Fruit, which is about the lynching of African American people in America. So Billie Holiday is an icon there, and she's talking about broken hearts, so it's kind of a reference to Tilly's past heartbreak with Ormond and Pablo. Now we also see a reference to Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye is about a boy who gets expelled from his school and is questioning the pretentiousness of the society and community of adults. And we see that a lot with Tilly too. There's also this this sense of there's also a kind of overarching theme of wanting to protect innocence in Catcher in the Rye. And once again here, Tilly herself was an innocent child and was not protected from the politics of adults. So the way that the adults viewed Molly should not have influenced the way that Tilly was treated. And Tilly was as a result of the adults' bias. She was unjustly treated, and she was removed from her mother. Oh, just as another point of reference, a lot of these texts that she mentions, they themselves come from the late 40s, early 50s, and that's kind of the time frame that she's set the novel at. And that kind of gives us clues as to when it's set, but it also gives us an idea of her inspirations. Okay, so once again, thanks for watching. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys next time.